we often feel like when John Brown is mentioned, Harriet Tubman is always the first person that's mentioned, and many people do not know many of the other abolitionist women, including black women, who had friendships and admired Brown, as Dr. Margaret was saying. But we can't ignore the Harriet Tubman story. It's epic in its own right, and of course, the way that John Brown figures in her story, and she figures in his story, make them. Which I found was a little. I was a little disappointed. By the way, if I could just say this, I was a little disappointed in the movie Harriet Tubman, and whatever else one may say about it, I enjoyed it, but I felt like John Brown was only there, I think, in an unnamed vignette and very briefly. So I was a little disappointed that they didn't treat that. But be that as it may, we're talking about them together. Just quickly go through this, and then maybe I'll come back to Shondell. According to Lily Chase Wyman, she wrote that when John Brown first found Harriet Tubman, I think that would have been in the spring of 1858, in St. Catharines, Canada West, which is Toronto. Harriet had already dreamt of Brown. She had already seen him in a dream. And in advance of the meeting, when John Brown met her, the tradition is that he shook hands with her 3 times, which, keeping in mind, especially for a kind of biblicist, three is a significant number. It has some sort of significance in itself. But he says the first I see is General Tubman, the second is General Tubman, and the third is General Tubman. And then they proceeded to talk. After that meeting, he wrote to his son John Jr. because Harriet Tubman had signed on and had committed herself to helping him raise men, particularly black men, to join him. And he said this: I came on here direct with Jermaine Logan the day after you left Rochester. I'm succeeding to all appearances beyond my expectations. And I get this: Harriet Tubman hooked on his whole team at once. Harriet, is the most of a man naturally that I ever met with. That's April 8th, 1858. Afterwards, in the summer, or June, early summer, 1858, he writes to Frederick Douglass on Harriet's behalf, asking him to raise some financial support for Harriet Tubman's own project. He says, when at your place, I forgot in my haste to say a word on behalf of my friend Harriet Tubman at St. Catharines, Canada West. She wants to raise $100 towards furnishing a home for herself and her aged father and mother. And here's the line again: anything you can do for General Tubman, the man of deeds, will be appreciated. And then the last kind of vignette we have, according to the abolitionist Wendell Phillips, Brown and Tubman met in probably the beginning of June 1859. That's the year of the raid. And according to Phillips, he said, the last time I ever saw John Brown was under my own roof in Boston, as Brown, brought Harriet Tubman to me saying, Mr. Phillips, I bring you one of the best and bravest persons on this continent, General Tubman, as we call her. So that's a very interesting kind of profile, vignettes of the interaction. But what's also fascinating is this language. And you know, I don't, when I first read this, especially in our context, in our contemporary context, I wonder how do we understand that? Because some people might say that's very insulting. And so I thought that I would ask Shondell and Margaret to weigh in on that, give us some perspective.
So earlier you made a joke about watching what you say, and people make that joke a lot when they hear psychologist. But as an environmental psychologist, I do analyze, study, come to understand in context people. And some of that is what they do socially, which ties into the culture of the moment. So we have time, we have place, and we have people. And so I contextualize. And in my work, when I look at masculinity, I'm looking at historic masculinity, certainly as embodied by John as a person who acted on behalf of people who could not repay him in any material sense in a time when those people were considered to be monetarily valuable rather than humanely valuable in and of themselves. And I also imagine the future of masculinity from today's standpoint as well. So when we think about what John might have been saying when he referred to Harriett as a man of deeds and the greatest man that he had ever known, I I understand him to be talking in the way of the Greeks. And so in reference to her courage, in reference to her works, which also feels like a biblical reference, by your work shall you be known, we have the concept of Andrea from the Greeks. And so the root word of Andrea is actually referring to adult males, but not in terms of biology, in terms of a fully formed moral person. And so it's also referring to a warrior virtue and acting for the sake of what is noble, regardless of fear, being steady in the face of fear, and acting for something that is greater than yourself. And so General Tubman showed herself to be an outstanding leader in the army, right? Combahee River Raid, which makes me want to come back to womanism and Black feminism as well. And the virtue, the bravery, the morality of Harriet, all of her actions, I think is what he was referring to. And so with Socrates, there were the references that you mentioned in the letters from Mary Stearns and Frances Ellen Watkins. So that visioning of John as a person who spoke the truth to the system and was persecuted for it, very apt. I want to make reference to Harriet and some of the quotes that she had about how she perceived John as being the greatest white man who ever lived, as being more valuable in his actions than and his life than 100 men doing what they could do at the level that they'd be willing to embody courage at all, And the other one that's not quoted very often, but I think Taya Miles did actually reference it in Night Flyer, is that he was a man who lived as Jesus Christ lived, and specifically that I sometimes think he was Jesus Christ come again. And so we can see those parallels there. And so speaking to what Margaret mentioned about declaration of sentiment and the exclusion of Black women at a time, it does raise a question for me about the 3/5 rule. At what point were we no longer 3/5 and became 5/5, and what that timing, where that aligns? But also thinking about then versus now and who is included in major movements for rights, inalienable rights. Feminism, then Black feminism, then womanism. That is when we started to think about intersectionality, these various ways of understanding experience and how it shifts in relevance according to people's particular place and their embodied experience. And so judging the past by today's standards is short-sighted and a bit foolhardy, right? Every species goes through its process of adaptive change. And so today, what we think of as, oh, of course, it should be considered in this perspective, though all the things that make that thought process possible did not exist in previous times. And so we can't put the burden of our today's standards on yesterday's experiences and knowledge making.
I mean, we can't impose our contemporary sense of things, if I understand correctly. And so, Margaret, do you want to step in also on this topic?
I agree with that to a point, because we can certainly learn a lot from the past, and this sort of reflects the women's movement, and some of the conflicts in terms of, well, even just to move ahead with the suffrage movement, and the Black suffrage movement, the passage of the 15th Amendment versus women's suffrage. I think that is a struggle that the abolitionists were the leaders of, and yet they split over this. And I think they've been split ever since. I think the feminist movement never really included Black women. And I think a lot of that, and as a movement, that isn't to say that various groups within the feminist movement did not embrace Black women, but I mean, as a movement, that was an issue. And I think that issue took us into the 20th and yes, even the 21st century. So, and one can say the same thing about race and the legacy of slavery.